That seat isn't yours, the mistress said. Then her billionaire husband learned the harsh truth. Juliet Pierce's white-gloved hand closed over the carved back of Nadia Rostova's chair. That seat isn't yours. The words carried across the owner's box with polished cruelty. Nadia held a heavy parchment charter against her red handbag, its wax sealed dark as fresh lacquer. Across from her, Conrad Sterling stood in a black tuxedo, one hand resting on the rail, as though the race below mattered more than the woman beside him. Juliet tilted her ivory hat and looked Nadia over. No lineage. No place. Some rooms cannot be entered through marriage. Conrad did not correct her. He smiled. That was the wound. Not the insult. Not the stolen seat. The smile told Nadia he had wanted this. She rose without protest. Enjoy the view, she said. Then she took the charter with her. Nadia crossed the private corridor before anyone could turn the humiliation into a longer performance. She did not look toward the photographers gathered near the stairwell. She did not ask Conrad to follow. The rain beyond the covered entrance had settled into a thin silver curtain, but she walked through it without slowing, the parchment protected beneath her coat. The driver opened the rear door. Nadia entered, placed the charter across her knees, and examined the seal. Unbroken. That mattered. Her breathing remained measured as the car moved away from the Royal Derby grounds. Only when the grandstand disappeared behind the wet glass did she allow herself one clear thought. Conrad believed he had removed her from his world. He had forgotten whose authority made that world legitimate. She opened her phone and called the quiet assistant. Access the succession archive. The response came at once. Nadia continued. Preserve every registry entry connected to Sterling Racing. No amendments. No renewals. No private approvals. She looked down at the seal bearing the old foundation crest. For 7 years, Conrad had treated her reserve as dependence. He had assumed her reluctance to display family power meant she possessed none. Worse, he had built his public mythology around that assumption. He bought estates, champion horses, private tables, and men who called him visionary. Nadia had supplied the one thing money could not create: authenticated continuity. She opened the charter carefully and reviewed the clause she already knew by memory. Foundation bloodline recognition remained valid only through the active consent of the sole hereditary trustee. Marriage conveyed no authority. Investment conveyed no authority. Possession conveyed no authority. Conrad had paid for horses. He had never owned the bloodline. Nadia removed a red pen from her handbag and marked 3 stable names listed beneath the current certification schedule. Prepare a hereditary review, she told the quiet assistant. Restricted circulation. Send notice only to the registry officer and the syndicate chairman. There was a pause on the line. Should the Sterling office be informed? Nadia watched a line of rain travel across the window, dividing Conrad's reflected world into narrow, distorted pieces. A warning would let him prepare a spectacle. Silence would force him to face procedure. She chose procedure. No warning. She closed the charter and pressed the wax seal flat beneath her palm. The pain was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer asking to be understood. It was becoming instruction. Begin the review. Nadia entered the private archive just after dusk, carrying the sealed charter beneath one arm. The room had belonged to her family long before Conrad learned how to pronounce the names recorded inside it. Dark walnut cabinets lined the walls. Each drawer held generations of breeding records, transfer histories, and signatures that had survived wars, bankruptcies, and men who believed ownership began with a purchase price. Nadia removed her damp coat and placed it over the back of a chair. Then she stood alone beneath the reading lamp. For the first time since leaving the Derby, she let herself remember his face. Conrad had once called her silence elegant. He had praised the way she entered crowded rooms without demanding attention, the way senior breeders lowered their voices when she spoke, the way she never confused display with authority. She had believed he understood her. That belief broke quietly. She remembered the first bloodline certificate she had signed for him, years before the magazines called him a racing king. His hands had trembled over the document, and he had promised that whatever they built would carry both their names. She had believed that promise because she loved the man beneath the ambition. Now she understood that he had loved the door her name could open. Today, when Juliet said Nadia had no lineage and no place, Conrad had not looked embarrassed. He had looked relieved. The truth settled with surgical precision. He had never admired her restraint. He had mistaken it for obedience. Nadia opened the nearest cabinet and removed the original succession ledger. Her name appeared beneath the final hereditary clause in black ink, witnessed years before her marriage. She traced no sentimental memories. She checked the date. Then she checked the authority code. Both remained valid. "Preserve the original," she said when the quiet assistant entered. The assistant placed archival gloves and a document stand beside her without asking questions. Nadia lifted the charter onto the stand and broke the outer protective ribbon, leaving the red wax seal intact. Conrad had entered the marriage believing he had rescued a reserved philanthropist from obscurity. In reality, Nadia had protected him from the humiliation of learning how little the racing establishment trusted new money without ancestral verification. She had introduced him to the right rooms, corrected the language in his first syndication proposal, and quietly authorized the bloodline certifications that transformed expensive horses into a recognized dynasty. He had used her legitimacy as scaffolding. Now he wanted to remove her from the building. That was the deepest injury. Not Juliet, not the chair, not even the affair disguised as social strategy. Nadia had defended a man who had never considered her a partner. She closed her eyes for one measured breath. No tears came. The absence of them did not make the wound smaller. It made the decision cleaner. What remained hers was larger than the marriage. The registry, the inherited authority, the institutional memory, and the discipline to use all three without spectacle. She opened a secondary volume and located Sterling Racing's active certifications. 3 champion lines, 11 breeding extensions, 26 pending offspring registrations. Everyone depended on continued recognition from the Foundation Bloodline Trust. Conrad thought the stable belonged to him because his name appeared on the gates. Nadia knew the gates were decorative. "Create 2 files," she told the quiet assistant. "One for historical certification, one for all pending commercial use. And the active race licenses? Flag them for review." The assistant nodded. Nadia marked the first page with her red pen, not as punishment, but as classification. She would not erase facts. She would separate what Conrad had purchased from what he had merely been permitted to claim. That distinction would decide everything. Her phone displayed 3 unanswered calls from him. She turned it face down. He was not calling to apologize. He was calling because silence no longer felt safe when it belonged to her. Nadia signed the preservation order with her full legal name, then placed the document beside the sealed charter. "Tomorrow," she said, "we determine what his empire is worth without my consent." By morning, the private archive had become a working registry office. Nadia stood at the central table while the registry officer arranged 3 sets of documents: hereditary certifications, commercial breeding licenses, and pending syndication records. The distinctions mattered. A horse could be owned, insured, transported, and trained by one party, while its elite bloodline status remained dependent on a separate chain of authentication. Conrad had always treated those layers as ceremonial. Nadia knew they were structural. "Start with the foundation, Mares," she said. The registry officer opened the oldest volume. Across the yellowed pages, one maternal line moved, through 5 generations in black ink, each name joined to the next by a seal, a date, and a signature no amount of money could reproduce. Beside the ledger lay a faded photograph of the first foundation mare, her dark head lifted above a winter field. Conrad had purchased descendants of that bloodline. Nadia's family had preserved its meaning. Nadia compared those entries against the digital files used by Sterling Racing. 2 extensions had been submitted under broad language Conrad's office assumed was permanent. They were not. Both relied on discretionary recognition from the Foundation Bloodline Trust, renewable only while the hereditary trustee judged the use consistent with the registry's standards. Nadia marked the clauses in red. Separate access from ownership. The quiet assistant began building a restricted review schedule. Each champion line was mapped to the privileges that depended on recognition: racing status, breeding value, insurance, transport, and syndicate access. The largest concentration surrounded Conrad's prize stallion, the horse he planned to syndicate for $200 million. Its value did not rest on speed alone. The price depended on an uninterrupted lineage recognized by the Foundation Registry and accepted by the Jockey Club. Without that recognition, the animal remained valuable. It did not remain dynastic. Nadia requested the original transfer chain. The registry officer placed 6 parchment instruments in order. Conrad's name appeared only on the latest ownership filing. Nadia's family seal appeared on every document that gave the lineage institutional meaning. "Preserve that distinction," she said. Across town, Conrad was preparing for the syndication hearing, as though the Royal Derby had settled every question about his place among the old racing families. He directed his executive assistant to move Juliet into the principal partner position for all photographs. He ordered a new media packet that described Sterling Racing as a self-made dynasty. Then he rejected the first draft because it referred to Nadia's philanthropic introductions and long-standing relationship with the registry. "Remove her name." The executive assistant hesitated. Conrad's voice hardened. "I built this." Yet his next question exposed the fear beneath the command. "Which founding families have confirmed attendance?" He asked again 20 minutes later, then once more before noon. Money had given Conrad access, but access never quieted his suspicion that the room could still recognize him as an outsider. Nadia's restraint had once protected him from that judgment. Now he was trying to erase the very evidence that revealed how he had entered. Juliet encouraged the revision. In an ivory writing code, she reviewed the guest list and suggested placing hereditary titles beside selected investors' names. Conrad approved it immediately. He did not notice that the more carefully he arranged symbols of legitimacy around himself, the more visible his hunger became. Back in the archive, Nadia authorized a confidential notice to the syndicate chairman. It did not accuse Conrad of fraud. It stated only that all pending Sterling transactions required hereditary revalidation before execution. Precise language. Maximum consequence. She then instructed the registry officer to place the prize stallion's bloodline certificate into provisional status until the hearing. "No public announcement," Nadia said. "Let the process reach him first." The quiet assistant handed her a draft notification for Conrad's office. Nadia read it, removed his courtesy title, and returned the page and signed. Not yet. She understood his weakness now, with greater clarity. Conrad did not merely want wealth. He wanted witnesses who would mistake wealth for ancestry. He needed Juliet beside him because she applauded the illusion without asking what held it up. Nadia closed the review file and pressed the red seal beside its restricted code. The system was ready. Now it only needed to be followed. You see, a man who simply buys the crown often makes the fatal mistake of insulting the woman who owns the gold. Real authority does not always answer an insult in the room where it happens. Sometimes it leaves quietly, carries the record with it, and waits for the system to ask who has the right to sign. The cruelty of the owner's box was never about a chair. It was about Conrad needing Nadia to look powerless so he could feel legitimate. He had mistaken her refusal to perform authority for the absence of it. But silence can hold many things: grief, discipline, memory, and the exact moment a woman decides she will no longer protect the man who diminished her. By noon, Nadia entered the archival registry chamber beneath the Foundation estate, where temperature-controlled cabinets protected the documents that defined more than a century of bloodline recognition. The room was not designed to impress visitors. It was designed to preserve truth. The registry officer had already arranged the Sterling files across a long black table. The senior counsel stood beside a stack of commercial agreements, each one marked, with a narrow white tab indicating where Conrad's ownership ended and Foundation authority began. Nadia removed her gloves and opened the first file. "Show me every active dependency." The registry officer presented the chain in order: the original maternal designation, the hereditary authentication, the Jockey Club recognition, the breeding license extensions, and the commercial syndication rights. Conrad's prize stallion stood at the center of all five. Its racing history was exceptional, but its projected $200 million value depended on a continuous certificate that only Nadia could renew. She examined the language line by line. No emotion entered the process. Accuracy was enough. The senior counsel indicated a clause Conrad's team had repeatedly described as administrative. In fact, it allowed the hereditary trustee to suspend recognition when a beneficiary misrepresented custodial access as permanent ownership. Conrad had done precisely that in the new investor materials. He had called Sterling Racing the founder of a dynasty, whose records predated his family by generations. Nadia drew one red line beneath the phrase, foundational owner. That statement is false, she said. Classify it as misrepresentation. The registry officer amended the review sheet. Nadia moved to the next file. 11 breeding extensions had been marketed as guaranteed. None were guaranteed. 26 future registrations had been priced into private offers. None were yet authenticated. The empire Conrad presented, as complete was, in legal and professional terms, a collection of permissions resting on her continued consent. Suspend provisional approvals, Nadia said. All of them. All dependent lines. The senior counsel studied her face, perhaps expecting anger. Nadia gave none. She rejected every recommendation that extended beyond the registry's authority. Conrad would face only the consequence his own misrepresentation had created. She signed the preliminary provenance suspension with a red pen, then pressed the foundation seal into warm wax at the bottom of the order. The mark was small. Its consequence was not. Copies were prepared for the Jockey Club, the syndicate chairman, the licensing officer, and the registry's international partners. Conrad would not receive a private warning. He would encounter the decision inside the same system he had assumed money could command. Nadia closed the final folder and placed the red wax order on top. Make the record exact. Conrad entered the private syndication preview, convinced the room had already accepted his version of history. The event occupied the upper gallery of the Jockey Club, where polished oak walls displayed portraits of bloodlines older than most modern corporations. He wore a black silk tie and a tailored evening coat chosen to suggest restraint, though every detail had been arranged to signal control. Juliet stood beside him in an ivory suit, one hand resting near the presentation table, as photographers framed her against the champion stallion's portrait. Before the photographers arrived, she had removed Nadia's principal badge from the seating board and replaced it with an ivory card bearing her own name above the words, Principal Partner. No appointment had been approved. She photographed it anyway. She understood her function. She was not there to discuss breeding ratios, maternal continuity, or registration standards. She was there to make Conrad look inherited. The next era begins tonight, she told the investors. Conrad approved the line with a slight nod. The private banker opened the valuation summary, placing the projected syndication price at $200 million. Around the table, representatives reviewed expected breeding premiums, international rights, and future registration income. Conrad spoke with the confidence of a man who believed repetition could become fact. Sterling Racing, he said, had created a modern dynasty from vision, discipline, and capital. Nadia's name never appeared. Her introductions, certifications, and hereditary approvals had been removed from the presentation as thoroughly as she had been removed from the owner's box. Conrad mistook omission for victory. Proceed to the lineage schedule, the private banker said. A white screen displayed the prize stallion's foundation ancestry, followed by the certification code issued through the Bloodline Trust. One investor leaned forward. Is the hereditary authentication permanent? Conrad answered, before the private banker could respond. The horse is mine. The lineage travels with the asset. The room remained polite, but the silence changed. A senior breeder studied the code again. Ownership and authentication are not always the same instrument. Conrad's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. In this case, they are functionally identical. They were not. He knew enough to understand the distinction, but admitting it would expose the one truth he could not tolerate. His empire depended on an authority he neither purchased nor controlled. Juliet stepped closer, and redirected the attention toward the stallion's race record. Conrad built this dynasty from nothing, she said. That is what makes it extraordinary. The praise restored his posture. He looked toward the photographers, then toward the list of confirmed guests for the hearing. Which founding houses have accepted? He asked the event coordinator. Most have acknowledged the invitation. Acknowledged is not accepted. His tone sharpened. I want confirmations. The event coordinator promised an updated list. Conrad asked again 10 minutes later. Then he instructed the communications team to add hereditary crests beside the names of attending families, even though several had not granted permission for such use. Juliet encouraged the display. She wanted the room to appear sealed around them, a visual proof that she had replaced Nadia not only in Conrad's life, but in the social architecture of the stable. Conrad welcomed the illusion, because Juliet never asked whether the doors belonged to him. She simply admired that they opened. Near the end of the preview, the private banker received a restricted notice and read it without changing expression. Conrad noticed. Is there a problem? A procedural review, the banker replied. Nothing that requires comment tonight. Conrad held his gaze a moment too long. From whom? The registry. That single word disturbed him more than a falling valuation would have. Money could be renegotiated. Status could not. Conrad turned back to the investors and raised his glass. Sterling Racing stands on permanent ground. The room followed the gesture, but not the certainty. Far beneath the gallery, sealed notices were already moving through the Jockey Club's internal offices. Conrad believed Nadia had left the field. In truth, she had entered the system. The first consequence appeared before Conrad reached his office the next morning. The licensing officer had placed the prize stallion's syndication file into suspended review, which meant no breeding shares could be offered, transferred, or insured at the announced valuation until hereditary authentication was restored. Conrad read the notice twice. Then he called the Jockey Club. Remove the hold. The answer was measured. The hold was not discretionary. It had been triggered by the foundation registry, and only the hereditary trustee could resolve it. Conrad ended the call without asking the question that frightened him most. He already knew who held that authority. By 10 o'clock, the private banker had revised the deal memo. The $200 million projection was replaced by a blank field labeled pending provenance confirmation. International brokers withdrew their preliminary interest. A breeding partner postponed a deposit, citing registration uncertainty. The insurer requested an amended lineage opinion before renewing coverage on the stable's highest valued horses. None of these actions looked dramatic alone. Together, they formed a professional verdict. The market did not need to accuse Conrad of anything. It only needed to stop believing his claims were complete. Juliet arrived in a cream cashmere coat and found the executive floor unusually quiet. She expected staff to greet her as the future public face of Sterling Racing. Instead, the executive assistant handed Conrad a packet of revised classifications and returned to the desk without acknowledging her. Juliet opened the social calendar on her phone. 2 luncheon invitations had been withdrawn. A charity committee moved her from the principal table to general seating. A photographer who had promised a cover feature requested proof that she held an official position within the syndicate. Her confidence depended on reflected access, and the reflection was beginning to weaken. This is temporary, Conrad told her. He said it too quickly. The registry officer's report arrived before noon. 3 champion lines had been moved from verified foundation status to pending authentication. 11 breeding extensions were no longer marketable as guaranteed. 26 future registrations required fresh approval. Conrad summoned his advisors and ordered them to challenge the classifications. The senior racing council explained that there was no ordinary appeal because the foundation had not revoked ownership. It had withdrawn recognition. Then by recognition, Conrad said. No one answered. That silence exposed the limit of his language. He understood acquisition, leverage, and price. He did not understand authority that refused to become merchandise. The private banker entered with a revised credit assessment. The stable's lending ratio had been tightened because its collateral value depended heavily on verified bloodline premiums. Conrad's jaw set. You valued those horses yesterday. Yesterday, the provenance was active. The banker's tone remained neutral. Today it is not. Juliet looked from one man to the other, calculating what neutrality meant. It meant the room had stopped protecting Conrad's pride. It meant people, who once laughed before he finished a sentence, were now waiting for documents. At the Foundation estate, Nadia reviewed the same sequence without satisfaction. She approved no public statement. She authorized no leaks. The purpose was not humiliation. The purpose was correction. She excluded veterinary care, staff payroll, feed contracts, and housing for the stable workers from every restriction. The horses would not suffer for Conrad's vanity. Neither would the people who had cared for them before the cameras arrived. Protect the innocent, she told the quiet assistant. The registry had one duty: distinguish what was inherited, what was purchased, and what had been falsely presented as permanent. Maintain professional silence, she told the quiet assistant. Let every institution reach its own conclusion. By late afternoon, Conrad's communications team had drafted a statement describing the review as a minor administrative delay. He approved it, then ordered Juliet to appear beside him at the hearing. He still believed Image could contain the damage. Yet when he asked whether the founding families had reconfirmed attendance, the event coordinator lowered her eyes and said they had confirmed only after receiving notice that the hereditary trustee would be present. Conrad did not ask her name. He did not need to. The system had finally turned toward the person he had tried to erase. The Jockey Club Syndicate hearing began at 3 in the afternoon, beneath portraits of founders, whose names Conrad had spent years trying to stand beside. He entered in a dark, formal coat, with Juliet on his arm, carrying the confidence of a man who still believed ceremony could overrule procedure. The private banker sat at the far end of the heavy oak table. The syndicate chairman reviewed the transaction packet without looking up. The registry officer placed a sealed file beside the licensing documents. No one rose for Conrad. That was the first fracture. He took the principal's seat anyway, and opened with the valuation he had repeated for weeks. $200 million for a controlled syndication of the prize stallion's breeding rights, supported by verified foundation lineage and international demand. His voice remained polished. His left hand did not. 2 fingers pressed against the table, as though he could hold the room in place. Proceed, he said. The syndicate chairman turned to the registry officer. The answer was brief. Foundational provenance had been withdrawn pending final hereditary determination. The syndication could not be recognized. Conrad leaned back, forcing calm into his posture. This is an administrative dispute. The horse is owned outright by Sterling Racing. Ownership is not under review, the registry officer replied. Authentication is. The distinction moved across the table with greater force than accusation. Representatives who had once praised Conrad's vision lowered their eyes to the documents. One breeding partner closed the presentation folder and slid it away. The private banker removed the unsigned financing memorandum from the table. Juliet shifted closer to Conrad, but her attention had moved toward the exit. Who authorized this? Conrad asked. The syndicate chairman looked toward the doors. Nadia entered wearing a structured red coat, the foundation charter held beneath one arm. Conversation stopped without instruction. The syndicate chairman rose first. The registry officer followed. Then, one by one, the hereditary representatives stood, not for Nadia's wealth, but for the office she carried. Conrad watched men who had accepted his invitations turn their bodies toward her, waiting for acknowledgement. Nadia gave a restrained nod and took the seat reserved for principal bloodline authority. Juliet was still occupying the chair beside it. The security guard approached. That place is restricted to registered principals. Juliet lifted her chin. I am here with Mr. Sterling. That does not establish authority. Juliet reached for the ivory badge she had displayed at the preview. The security guard examined it, turned it over once, and placed it beside the visitor log. It carried no registry number. She looked to Conrad for correction. He had none to give. Juliet rose slowly, gathered her ivory gloves, and moved to the visitor row. No one made space for her near the table. The humiliation was quiet, which made it complete. Conrad turned to the private banker. You understand the commercial value here. I understand verified value, the banker said. His voice held no hostility, only distance. Conrad looked toward the breeding partners. One studied the ceiling. Another began speaking softly with Nadia's registry officer. The executive assistant, standing near the rear wall, no longer moved when Conrad gestured for the transaction summary. He had to ask twice. The loyalty he had purchased through salary, access, and proximity was evaporating into professional caution. Then the registry officer read the revised designation. Conrad Sterling was listed as the current owner of the animals and a temporary beneficiary of Foundation authentication. Temporary beneficiary. The phrase stripped away years of self-invention. Conrad glanced toward the founder portraits above the table. For years, he had imagined his own portrait among them. Now he could not hold his gaze there. His hand tightened, then loosened around the pen. He had feared this room would see him as new money. Now it saw something worse. A man who had mistaken borrowed legitimacy for personal sovereignty. Juliet glanced at the banker's closed memorandum, then at Conrad's face. Her hand moved away from the back of his chair. He noticed. That was the second fracture. Nadia opened the charter, but did not look at him. "Continue the record," she said. The syndicate chairman declared the $200 million offering inadmissible. Every eye that once reflected Conrad's importance now waited for Nadia's next instruction. He had not lost the horses. He had lost the meaning that made them an empire. Conrad found Nadia in the private review room. After the hearing, standing beside a narrow table, where the charter, the final registry report, and the revoked syndication packet had been arranged in precise order. The room held no audience, no photographers, no old families waiting to be impressed. Only the two of them, and the paper trail he had spent years pretending was decorative. He closed the door behind him. "We can correct this." Nadia did not turn immediately. She finished reading the final page, placed it flat, and capped her red pen. "The record is already correct." Conrad stepped closer, lowering his voice, as though intimacy could restore authority. "You made your point. Reinstate the certification, and I will restructure the syndication. You can take a percentage. Name it." Nadia looked at him then. Not with anger, with recognition. Even now, he was offering money, because money was the only language that had never forced him to examine himself. "You think this is a negotiation over price? Everything has a price. That belief brought you here." His jaw tightened. He shifted tactics. He called the Derby incident a misunderstanding, then a public relations error, then Juliet's poor judgment. He said he had been under pressure to present a unified image before the syndication. He claimed Nadia had always resisted visibility. He suggested that reinstating the bloodline would protect both of them from scandal. Each explanation moved responsibility away from the moment he had chosen silence. Nadia listened until he ran out of softer words for betrayal. Then she opened the charter to the hereditary clause. "Read this." Conrad did not move. "You know what it says." "Read it anyway." His eyes dropped to the line defining all commercial holders as temporary beneficiaries of Foundation recognition. Nadia drew one red line beneath those two words and turned the charter toward him. Temporary beneficiary. The phrase reduced his dynasty to permission. Conrad's hand hovered near the page, but did not touch it. "I bought every horse in that stable." "Yes." "I funded the trainers, the estates, the insurance, the breeding program." "Yes." "Then this cannot be taken from me." Nadia's voice remained even. The horses were not taken. The legitimacy was withdrawn. He looked at her, as if the distinction were cruelty. "It was only truth. You never wanted a wife, Conrad. You wanted a witness who would call your purchase a birthright." The sentence landed where money could not protect him. His posture changed almost imperceptibly. The confidence remained, but the performance around it weakened. Nadia continued. "You needed Juliet because she admired the crown. You needed me silent because I knew who had granted it." Conrad's face hardened. "You are making this personal. You made it personal when you used my authority, erased my name, and smiled while another woman told me I had no lineage." She slid the final revocation order into place. "You were not afraid of losing me. You were afraid they would learn you had always needed me." For the first time, he had no answer. Nadia signed the order with her full legal name. The red ink settled beneath the Foundation seal. Final revocation. Effective immediately. Conrad glanced toward the door, perhaps expecting the private banker, an advisor, anyone who might still respond to his importance. No one came. Nadia gathered the charter and left the unsigned rescue proposal on the table. "You did not lose because you lacked money," she said. "You lost because you mistook access for ownership." Then she walked out first, leaving Conrad alone in a room where nothing moved at his command. True sovereignty is never fighting for a seat in the room. It is waiting for the room to realize you own the building. Nadia had learned that freedom did not arrive when Conrad lost access to the bloodline registry, or when Juliet discovered that borrowed elegance could not survive without borrowed authority. Freedom arrived earlier. It began the moment Nadia stopped asking whether the man she had loved would finally understand her worth. Some betrayals end a marriage. Others end an illusion. Conrad had believed that dignity without spectacle was weakness, that silence meant consent, and that a woman who did not advertise her power could be removed without consequence. Nadia no longer needed him to admit how wrong he had been. His recognition was not the final signature. Hers was. 3 weeks after the hearing, the founder's room opened for the seasonal bloodline review. The chamber stood behind 2 carved oak doors inside the Jockey Club, far from the cameras, champagne tables, and social performances that had once defined Conrad's idea of influence. No one entered without registry authorization. No one sat before the hereditary chair arrived. Nadia walked in wearing a structured red coat, over a black silk dress, carrying the restored charter and a slim red notebook. The syndicate chairman stood. The registry officer placed the master ledger at the head of the table. Around it sat representatives of breeding houses that had survived because they understood the difference between possession and stewardship. Nadia took her seat. No announcement was required. She opened the ledger to the first pending line and reviewed the maternal history, transfer permissions, health records, and breeding limitations. One representative requested approval for an international extension. Another presented a revised custodial agreement. Nadia listened, asked exact questions, and marked each decision with her red pen. The room waited for her judgment, not because she demanded obedience, but because her authority had been earned, inherited, and exercised with discipline. "Approve the first line," she said. The registry officer recorded the decision. Outside that room, Conrad retained ownership of several expensive horses, but without foundation authentication. Their value rested only on performance and private demand. The dynasty he had claimed had become stable again. Juliet's society invitations thinned when it became clear she held no title, no office, and no recognized place within the syndicate. She had wanted the photograph of power. Nadia held the function of it. Yet Nadia did not build her future around their decline. She expanded the trust's philanthropic program for retired racing staff, established independent oversight for bloodline claims, and removed every clause that allowed social influence to pressure registry decisions. Her freedom was not revenge prolonged. It was order restored. At the end of the meeting, Nadia closed the ledger and placed the red wax charter beside it. The old money representatives remained silent, waiting for the final approval on the season's registry. Nadia signed her full name across the last page. The representatives waited for her closing instruction, but Nadia did not remain at the head of the table to receive congratulations. She returned the red pen to her notebook, gathered the charter, and left through the carved oak doors. Beyond the private corridor, she crossed the quiet paddock behind the Jockey Club. A retired foundation mare stood beneath the bare branches, her dark coat carrying the last pale light of the afternoon. Nadia removed one red glove and rested her palm against the mare's warm neck. No cameras followed. No title was announced. For the first time in years, power did not feel like something she had to defend. It felt like peace. She walked toward the stable path, without waiting for anyone to open the way. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.